podcast serves the goals of telling the stories of special operations during the global war on terror, and for it, we have on Wesley Morgan, an embedded journalist who has covered U.S. troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and is known for his masterful covering of the Pech Valley for his book, The Hardest Place, and for his upcoming project, A Look into the Secretive Nature of 127 ECHO, a title authority allowing US SOF to operate with local surrogates against violent extremist organizations. Hey Wes, how's it going, man? It's
Cool.
great to have you on the podcast. Appreciate you coming on. It's we're pretty much in the early stages of this project, so it does mean a lot to have someone with your level of insight and just understanding of the type of stuff that we're interested in to have you come talk to us.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I enjoy the Instagram account, and I pick up little tidbits there that are of interesting pieces of GWOT history. So happy to help out.
Hey, it goes both ways, man. We've learned quite a bit from some of the work that you've done detailing, as far as the hardest place goes, the Pech Valley, all that stuff. We've used a lot of it as research for, sort of the podcast and stuff like that. So you've
Cool.
had a pretty interesting journey covering the GWOT. You've done multiple embeds in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I do want to talk about the hardest place. I really do, but also, as someone who's a nerd about the kind of stuff that you're going to cover, I'm interested in your current project. It's a new book that's going to explore the use of 127 ECHO, that program, and really just how U.S. special operations use these local partners as surrogates in various countries. I mean, Cameroon, Somalia, Tunisia, the list honestly goes on and on. Some of these regions have a pretty small U.S. presence as it is, and it's mainly tailored for counterterrorism. Do you want to just talk about, giving our listeners a sneak peek into what the book's going to cover? And,
Yeah, absolutely.
exactly what the 127 ECHO program really entails.
So this book it's in the very early stages. It doesn't have a title yet, nothing like that. But the idea is I want to use Afghanistan as kind of the backbone of a story about the use of surrogate forces by the United States military and the CIA during the global war on terrorism. So, the 20-year war in all of its different theaters. And so there's basically two. We can talk about sort of what's the difference between a partner and a surrogate, and is one a subset of the other, and are these useful words? Or I think those are really interesting topics, and that I'm going to try and tackle them in the book. But in the context of post 9/11 counterterrorism operations and the way U.S. military special operators and CIA operatives talk about them, surrogates are essentially that subset of local partner forces that U.S. forces directly pay and control via formal arrangements. And these are often secret formal arrangements so that on the outside they look like other partner forces. But sort of the two main mechanisms by which this has been done over the past years are, one, the CIA has through presidential findings and Title 50 of the U.S. Code, it has covert action authority that allows it to pay and control partner and surrogate forces. In the early years after 9/11, during the initial invasion of Afghanistan, Green Berets and the CIA kind of linked up and worked together. But then Green Berets sort of realized that, unlike the CIA, they didn't have a means to pay their Afghans, the militias that they were sort of trying to harness and train in the aftermath of the invasion. And the result was a piece of legislation in 2005 that at the time was known as Section 1208, now known as Section 127 ECHO, and it has sort of spawned an offshoot as well called Section 1202. But these pieces of legislation are essentially what allow U.S. Special Operations Forces to do something that may seem very just sort of pedestrian. That's what Special Operations Forces do, but which in fact they didn't have the budgetary authority to do before 2005, which is pay local partners. And that's not all that Section 127 ECHO does. And there are cases where pay is not part of the equation. It's a very flexible authority. But that is the key thing that it does that other authorities available to Special Operations Forces do not do. It allows for this this direct payment of local forces. And then by extension from that, the operations that are funded by Section 127 ECHO typically involve arrangements with a host country wherein the U.S. is essentially borrowing or renting a small host country force. And the host country is explicitly authorizing the United States to use it, to achieve U.S. counterterrorism ends. And those arrangements vary from country to country. In some cases, there are ones where there is no such agreement because the U.S. is working with a non-state actor or a sub-state actor, which is something that 127 ECHO also allows you to do that other types of kind of security assistance authorities do not allow you to do. But that's that's the brief version of what 127 ECHO is. There's probably a very small number of 127 ECHO nerds in the world, so it's fun to be talking to another one. But yeah, I'd be happy to chat anything related to that, sort of how I came across that authority in the first place and started covering it, and et cetera.
Yeah, definitely, man. I did kind of want you to expand on that a little bit. So my general understanding of this is, would it be safe to say that these host nation surrogates aren't really answerable to the host nation, and they're almost a proxy, kind of carrying out directives where the U.S. is politically or tactically unwilling to put many ground troops themselves? Does that kind of play into it at all, the risk-averse nature?
I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that they're not answerable to the host nation, because typically the host nation has agreed via formal arrangement with the United States to this, and often, in fact, has requested it because they see it as beneficial to them in one way or another. There are cases where, for instance, the Puntland Security Force in northern Somalia is an example of a 127 ECHO funded security surrogate force, originally a CIA funded surrogate force that was not, for a long time, was not part of the Somali state apparatus. So that's one that did not answer to a host government. It answered only to its U.S. masters, essentially. But far more common in the kind of past 10 years, especially in the AFRICOM context, are cases where the host government willingly loans out these units under a memorandum of understanding with the embassy and with AFRICOM and Special Operations Command, kind of in return for whatever it is that they perceive as the benefit of participating in this program. And that's something that varies a lot, country by country by country. And the host nations may not be sort of up for talking about it. I mean, a common scenario is host country is happy to have any help the U.S. can provide, happy for one of its elite units to receive training and equipment and direction from U.S. Special Operations Forces, but is unwilling for its own public to be privy to that arrangement because it could appear to be a violation of sovereignty. So that's kind of, that's a lot of the rationale surrounding the secrecy of 127 ECHO programs, from my perspective, comes down to the delicate politics of it for the host governments, who often are witting and willing partners, but who would face domestic political consequences or believe they would face domestic political consequences if the true nature of the arrangement became known.
And furthermore, how much different is Section 1208 from 127 ECHO proper? Is it a completely different title authority? Do they kind of revolve around each other?
Well, so the legislative history is Section 1208 was created in 2005 as a temporary authority, and it kept for a number of years. It kept for about a decade. It kept being extended in 1 and 2 and 3 year increments. The amount of money being upped a little bit each time. And in 2017. Section 1208 was codified as Section 127 ECHO, meaning it became permanent. So 1208 was the temporary predecessor to the permanent 127 ECHO funding authority that we have today. The sort of the offshoot authority is Section 1202. Which is still a temporary authority, although it may become permanent this year. There's a push for that to happen. That's what DoD wants Congress to codify it the same way that it codified 1208 as 127 ECHO. But the difference between the 1208 127 ECHO authorities on the one hand and the 1202 sort of offshoot authority on the other hand is that 1208 and its successor 127 ECHO are scoped specifically and only for counterterrorism missions. They can only be used in the context of counterterrorism. The 1202 authority was was created essentially to broaden that, to be able to use surrogate forces in the context of great power competition, in the Pacific theater and in the European theater, which is something that I've covered. I covered a little bit for the Washington Post, and I think there will be more to come this year because of some developments over the past year regarding 1202 and limitations on how it can and can't be used.
So I definitely do want to get back into the 127 Echo stuff. We're definitely going to cover that with a lot of depth, but kind of want to get into your early life a little bit. So you're our first guest who hasn't served in the military, yet you have this pretty close understanding of the military and how it operates specifically in combat operations. You can probably better than me attest that the military is a pretty unique, somewhat closed off organization, and there's a lot of technicalities there, for lack of a better term. Does a journalist really need to know how a special operations task force is organized? Do they need to know what a MATV is, what the difference between a troop and a squadron and Delta Force is? Not really, but I feel like if you're trying to detail the United States fight in these forever wars, as a lot of people call them, the minute details are important. So I'm curious to learn.
There are different philosophies and approaches to journalism. I started covering the military when I was very young. I first went to Iraq and embedded there as a stupid freelancer when I was 19 at what turned out to be the all-time peak of violence during the Iraq surge. And so my approach has always been kind of build up from the small to the big. Understand how an infantry squad works and how an infantry platoon works by hanging around with them and going on their patrols and talking to squad leaders, sort of winning them over who may not want you around. And then, the more you do of that, the more you understand how an infantry battalion works. And the more infantry battalions you visit, and I was very lucky to be able to visit quite a lot of them at sort of the height of the golden era of embedding, which was kind of the golden era of transparency between the U.S. military and the press, and in the first sort of 10 years or so of the forever wars. And then, eventually, for me, I eventually can see a big picture from a mosaic of the little pictures. And that's just how my brain works and how I approach things. So there are other people who very successfully cover national security kind of from a top-down approach. But yeah, for me, I really want to know the nitty gritty, and I want to know it from kind of the practitioners at the lowest levels before I then go to their battalion commanders and brigade commanders and the generals and hear their versions of things.
So I think that's very close to the way like you said, an enlisted soldier, or maybe a junior officer, a platoon commander, a platoon leader would kind of look at it. And that's what I found interesting about The Hardest Place was really just how you related to these soldiers, provided a little bit of detail about their backgrounds as you explained the different units that rotated in and out of the Pech Valley. So I did want to know a little bit more about your background and how this interest, this almost obsession in the military developed. What was growing up like for you, Wes?
I'm just a weird war nerd. I grew up as a little, there's no rhyme or reason to it. My parents weren't in the military or anything like that. I grew up reading about Vietnam and painting G.I. Joes so that they would have the right tiger stripe uniforms and MACV insignias. And then it all kind of became, real rather than historical for me. I was 13 when 9/11 happened. And when I got to college, I as a teenager, I obsessively followed the news out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, there was a lot more and a lot more detailed and granular news about U.S. military operations back then in the mid 2000s as a result of, embedding conventional military operations anyway. So there was, I could literally just sit there and from embedded reports and PAO press releases and stuff, I could put together a map of Iraq that showed where every infantry battalion in the country was and keep track of their movements and stuff like that. And so, when I got to college, I just knew I wanted to see these wars and I wanted to learn about them. It wasn't that I wanted to participate in them. But the first sort of obvious thing that I did, I just thought, well, what do you do? I joined ROTC because I figured, okay, well, that's what you do. But then I quickly got derailed by another opportunity that I was, it's probably my personality is better suited for, which was I was able to start going to Iraq as a freelancer. And basically, once I started, I didn't want to stop because as stupid as it seems now, In 2007, 2008, 2009, when I was in college, my feeling was I got to get on this because these wars might be over by the time I graduate.
There's probably definitely some kids out there right now that are painting their GI Joes in multicam. Kind of doing what you did, but adapting it to what's going
Yeah.
on nowadays in the twilight of the GWOT. So I did want to ask you about 9/11 and kind of what impact that had on this interest of yours, and how it did it impact at all what you wanted to do with your life going forward. And I asked this as someone who's a little younger. I mean, I was born 3 days after we jumped in Objective Rhino, and I know I grew up with the GWOT, sort of as a backdrop for
That's
everything I
so
was doing.
yeah. I mean, yeah, it had a huge impact on me. I'm not from New York. I'm from Boston. But I mean, I was I was in eighth grade when 9/11 happened, and it just, I mean, it definitely completely changed kind of the course of my life. From probably I'd be like a medieval historian somewhere, in some obscure history department were it not for 9/11. Because that just it went from being a historical interest to an interest in these are the wars of our time.
So how'd you end up getting into the journalist piece of it? Was journalism something that you were interested in as you were growing up? Did it kind of just serve as a way to see these wars firsthand, or was it a little bit deeper than that? Really, where did journalism kind of enter your life?
Yeah, that's a good question. My parents are both writers. They're not journalists, but so writing kind of runs in the family. My mom wrote murder mysteries. My dad has written, histories of kind of esoteric subjects like 3D movies, things like that. So writing is just sort of, reading and writing is just, kind of part of the deal with my family. I had never sort of specifically thought about journalism as a career path until I kind of fell into it. Initially I wasn't thinking of it as, oh, this is what I'm going to do for my life. I just thought, oh, wow, I have this incredible opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity as a literal teenager to go see the surge in Iraq unfold. And I just was not going to pass that up. And when I was there in 2007, in between bouncing around to different infantry units and cavalry units, you'd pass through this sort of the big public affairs headquarters in the Green Zone, and meet other journalists. And I met some friends and mentors who have remained really influential to me in the rest of my life, including Michael Gordon from the New York Times. I met that trip. Now he's at the Wall Street Journal, but he's older journalist who he just covered the wars in Iraq for his whole career. He wrote a book about Desert Storm, which he covered Desert Storm at the time. He wrote a best-selling book about the 2003 invasion of Iraq called Cobra 2, which was how I knew about him and was like, oh, you're Michael Gordon when I saw him walk into this little press tent. And then I wound up working for him after college on his third Iraq book, just this big tome called The End Game, kind of about the 2003 to 2011 U.S. involvement in Iraq. And his fourth Iraq book came out about a year ago. It's called Degrade and Destroy. It's about the OIR campaign, and it has a lot of really interesting details about the special operations fight. I mean, from my perspective, he's written really the only kind of military history of OIR. He's the only guy who's sort of bothered to get into, what did this look like inside the U.S. military. But so he was a big influence on me. I met him that first summer. I also met Evan Wright that first summer, the author of Generation Kill, and have remained friends with him. But so essentially, I went back to college for my sophomore year after the summer of 2007 in Iraq. And while I was there, I was in touch with Michael Gordon, and he sort of convinced me, hey, the time that, strike while the iron is hot. There is a lot to see and there is a lot to cover. And you have this momentum. So I wound up taking some time off of school, leaving school for a while, just to go back to Iraq, kind of see the tail end of the surge and post-surge period, and then start going to Afghanistan.
Where were you going to school, and what for at this point?
I did my undergrad at Princeton. I don't have any advanced degree or anything. I studied public policy, which was just kind of for me, it was the major that allowed me to take a bunch of different classes in a bunch of different stuff. There was a good, Near Eastern Studies department, public policy department that had classes on kind of national security related issues. And then there also was a small journalism program. So I just sort of tried to take as many of those things as I could, while also trying to, survive my various requirements.
So something that's going to be a little unfamiliar to our listeners, and even some of the guests that we've had on come from, special operations backgrounds where they might not encounter journalists. They might be on the JSOC side where the access seems to be, a little bit more restricted. What is the embedding program exactly? How did it work throughout the GWOT? And I understand that it's not really around anymore, or at least to the degree that it once was.
Yeah, it no longer exists. It has died a slow death starting in about 2013. But for the first decade of the wars, it was a very expansive program that was directed by the George W. Bush administration in the opening phases of the wars, essentially to give maximum transparency to journalists and the American public of what the U.S. military was doing. There were exceptions to this. When you embedded, there was an agreement that you signed. You were never censored. No one ever, the military did not claim the right to try and read your work before you published it or anything like that. Unlike some other militaries, the British military always tried to read your work before you published it, which I think is, pretty egregious censorship, kind of World War II type stuff. The U.S. military never did that. They were only the rules surrounding embedding were, some very common sense things like, if you're there when a soldier dies, which, happened on a few occasions for me, you're obviously not going to publish that soldier's name before his family is notified. Very common sense. No one has a problem with that rule. Some other rules like not reporting on SIGINT and HUMINT. And then, the most frustrating one was don't talk about the task force, meaning the JSOC task force. And that was kind of the biggest segment of the war that you just couldn't see or could only see out of your peripheral vision as you were covering the counterinsurgency fight and embedding with these conventional units. You'd see hints of it. You'd see, I remember being in Mosul and seeing, one morning being out at the site of a car bombing with this cavalry platoon, and we saw these strikers drive past, and everybody thought, "Oh, sick! That's Delta Force." I mean, in fact, it was Rangers. I know with the benefit of hindsight, they kind of had the portfolio in Mosul at the time, and you see hints of them around. And so where I really kind of got to know more about that was I got really fascinated by this place, the Pech Valley in northeastern Afghanistan, that I wrote the book, The Hardest Place, about. And I initially went into that book project thinking of it as a history of the infantry battalions that fought up there, including, the one that I first embedded with partway through the war, and the infantry battalions that preceded it, and the infantry battalions that followed it. But what I kind of came to learn was, really the war that I had seen was one of two wars that were being fought in this in this part of Afghanistan and in many other parts of Afghanistan and Iraq. There was sort of this daytime counterinsurgency war that we embedded journalists had pretty unfettered access to. That was being fought by the infantry units, the cavalry units, the field artillery units, the provincial reconstruction teams. And then there was this nighttime war that, often was referred to, as the counterterrorism war, although in reality, often who they were going after, especially in Afghanistan, was very low level insurgents. And it was more like they were playing offense in counterinsurgency than that they were doing counterterrorism much of the time. But what I found in doing the research for the Pech book was these stories are really kind of inextricably intertwined, and you couldn't tell one without the other. So I just, I dove as deep as I could into, the role that the JSOC task force had played along the way, kind of, out of sight during the war in the Pech. And I was very lucky with, the number of, especially Rangers and SEAL Team 6 guys who were the two elements that really had Afghanistan for JSOC during those years of the war, especially the East, with how many of them were willing to to share and to sort of try and explain to me this other side of the war that I had only seen sort of the little trace evidence of at the time.
So, I mean, could you imagine being a 19-year-old journalist and you're out with a CAG troop or a DEVGRU troop on an objective?
That would probably be unwise. It's funny though. I mean, in later years, when I was covering the Pentagon for Politico in 2017 to 2020, and embedding had kind of died off. It just didn't happen anymore. And I can explain sort of my theories on why embedding died off. But we would ask, say, can I do an embed with, because by that point, mostly special operations forces were the forces out there doing the fighting. So obviously you want to cover them, you want to embed with them. I remember the sort of the excuse I would get from DoD public affairs officers was, we can't have journalists out with special operations forces like Green Berets. That's just too much of a. And I would say, well, wait a minute. My first trip to Afghanistan, I embedded with Green Berets, and I was 21, and it was not a problem for anybody. Because although the JSOC task force was off limits to journalists, the theater SOF, the siege SOF, they were not off limits. It was a little more complicated to embed with them than it was with conventional forces. There were more hoops you had to jump through, but you could do it. And so I tend to think that most of the excuses offered by the Defense Department over the past decade for sort of why they've done away with embedding are excuses and not real reasons.
How'd you find embedding with the Green Berets that you mentioned earlier, compared to the conventional troops that you embedded with as well? Is there a difference in terms of access that you get to whatever's going on?
I found them very similar. I mean, I think, they were older. There was, the teams that I embedded with in 2009 in Wardak Province were a mixture of active duty third group teams and National Guard teams out of Rhode Island. I forget whether they were 19th and 20th group. And you could see a difference between those teams. But there's so many flavors to the military. I mean, it wasn't any more different to me than, say, embedding with a National Guard, advisor team where everybody is much older than in a conventional infantry unit, had been. I mean, I think everywhere I went, there'd sort of be, whether it's an infantry platoon, whether it's an ODA, whatever it is, there might be 10% of the people there are immediately very excited that the journalist is there. They have stories that they want to tell. They're interested in kind of getting their version of the war and their experiences of the war heard by the American public. And maybe you got another 10% of guys who just absolutely want nothing to do with you, or just, either because of just sort of their understanding of the media or because they've had a previous bad experience with the journalist, whatever the reason may be. And then you've got 80% of guys who kind of just couldn't care less so long as you don't cause any kind of trouble for them, so long as you're not stupid out on patrol, so long as you are capable of following instructions and getting behind concealment and cover when told to, et cetera, et cetera. So really everywhere I went, I mean, I generally found people pretty friendly, pretty happy to chat. Often there was sort of an initial barrier to get over of just hang out for a few days and, watch movies with them, go on patrol with them, and wait until people sort of warm up to you.
So that kind of ties into my next question of just really what is it like being an embed? Obviously, you're there for much different reasons than the soldiers and the infantry battalion or the Green Berets and the ODA are there for. How plugged in are you into the day-to-day stuff? You mentioned going out on patrols, but are you going out on night raids? Do you get to sit in on the briefings? I guess I'm trying to ask is how much access do you really get as an embedded journalist?
Yeah. I mean, again, acknowledging that the JSOC task force was not part of this deal. When you were embedding with infantry forces and conventional forces, I mean, you pretty much had the run of the place if you sort of knew how to do it and knew what to take advantage of and knew what to ask to go on and how to make your case and push your case and so on. I mean, I remember in 2008 in Iraq going on night raids with conventional forces, which at the time I took totally for granted that this was just something, that every infantry battalion had a time-sensitive target platoon whose job was to do night raids. I only now understand in retrospect that this was kind of an innovative thing that hadn't been happening before about 2007 and was part of kind of a passing down of TTPs from JSOC to conventional forces to allow them to, action SIGINT-based targets that there just were so many more than the task force itself could action on any given night. But to me, it just, I didn't know about that. I couldn't report on SIGINT anyway if I wanted to or if I'd understood it. I just knew that this was, you went out with them on their patrols during the day, and then they also did raids at night. And those were kind of the two sides of counterinsurgency.
What got your interest? Sorry,
as far as as far as sort of what your access is, I mean, there's that, you could go out on every, patrol you want. And I probably sometimes erred a little too much on the side of, well, yeah, I'm just going to go out on every patrol and soak it all up. I mean, I remember once sort of had a story that probably could have been on the front page of the New York Times, but I instead I went out on another patrol because I just felt like it was what I wanted to do, and that might have been kind of dumb of me because I kind of missed the window to have this little battlefield snapshot have broader exposure than it wound up having. But so there was that type of access, but there was also you wanted to contextualize what you were seeing, right? You wanted to and then this was sort of where kind of knowing the jargon and knowing the language came in, is on your way into an embed and on your way out of an embed, you'd sort of be briefed by the brigade and battalion headquarters. And it could be very easy to just kind of let your eyes glaze over and say, this is just an endless flood of acronyms, and I'll wait and see what the guys out in the platoons have to say about it. But if you kind of knew what you were listening for, that was a really interesting level of the war, kind of the battalion, kind of this battalion level of the war. And it wound up being the level of the war that I was kind of most interested in and I felt was least understood by the American public. Because kind of my sense was, because of all the embedded journalism, people knew what an infantry platoon did. You could watch it on TV, you could read articles in various newspapers about what it was like to be, young soldiers out doing the counterinsurgency patrolling and raiding. And then people have an idea about what generals do. But what does a lieutenant colonel do? What does a major do? What does a captain on staff do? And what does that mean for kind of how a battalion is employed? I always felt like that was the part that was harder to convey and often really, really interesting. Because, even if it's sort of bureaucratic and it's happening in the JOC, or in the operations center, it would have really important consequences for, what the troops in the field are doing.
So I did want to go back to the Pech Valley, and what was the first time you really sort of heard about the Pech Valley? And what piqued your interest in it versus the other kinetic AOs in Afghanistan, some of which I'm sure you've spent time in? How is it different than, the Sangins, the Arghandab Valleys?
Right. It's funny you say Sangin and Arghandab because so I first went to the Pech in the summer of 2010, and the other embeds that I did that summer were Sangin with 40 Commando Royal Marines, the Arghandab Valley with a battalion of the 101st, a place in Paktika with another battalion of the 101st. And then I sort of fell into this embed in the Pech, not really knowing a lot about it. I mean, I had read, there was a very famous New York Times Magazine article from 2007 or 2008 called Battle Company is Out There. That was about the experience of Battle Company of the 173rd during Operation Rock Avalanche in the Korengal. And, when I basically what happened was I was trying to go to this one battalion in Eastern Kunar, but some reason I couldn't go to it. Flights were canceled, weather, something like that. And somebody suggested, well, why don't you go to their sister battalion in Western Kunar in the Pech? Because the battalion commander there, this guy, Colonel Ryan, he's like, he'll be pretty candid with you. He'd be interesting to talk to. So I went and I, in the little, the little hotel on Bagram for journalists, like these little plywood shacks where you'd stay. I fired up my laptop, went and reread Elizabeth Rubin's Battle Company is Out There article, looked at Google Maps to try to figure out how does the Pech relate to the Korengal. Didn't really quite understand it until I flew over it, and you could see coming in from Jalalabad kind of this the way the terrain was. I mean, it looked like a leaf, basically. You know, the Pech Valley is the spine of the leaf, and then all these little smaller valleys are feeding into it. The Korengal, the Weigall, the Waterpoor. And when I visited that first time in 2010, U.S. forces had just finally pulled out of the Korengal after about, I mean, they had been banging around in there for 5 or 6 years, depending on where you count the start date. And they had finally executed the withdrawal after, you know, a lot of struggles and bureaucratic hassles. And what was really fascinating to me, among other things, was, you know, I get to this battalion that's just deployed. It's the first battalion in the Pech that's not sort of shackled by having a company in constant contact in the Korengal. But the fighting has just shifted down to the mouth of the Korengal. And so this battalion commander, Colonel Ryan, who now is the 25th Infantry Division commanding general in Hawaii, or he might have recently come out of command. But I remember he was very candid with me on the way in. Basically his thinking was, hey, look, the previous unit came out of the Korengal. This was their logic for doing it. I'm trying to understand why that logic doesn't apply to the Pech itself. And what, you know, why we shouldn't just pull out of the Pech itself, which was what he wound up making the case for and executing later in the deployment, which was, to me, that was really fascinating, because this is the summer of President Obama's surge, the peak of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. And everywhere else that I went in the country that summer, you know, even Sangin, even the Arghandab, the battalion commanders were really optimistic, you know, sometimes in retrospect to the point of delusion, about you know, the progress they were making, you know, how many kilometers of roads they had paved, how many more kilometers of road was going to be paved by the time they left, you know, all the outposts that they had built, all the new outposts that were going to be built by the time they left to hand it off to the next guy. And it was you know, it was the height of coin in Afghanistan. And then I go up to this place, the Pech, where it turns out kind of coin has been underway for a little longer, because there's a backstory to, you know, U.S. forces started spreading out into outposts and building roads there long before the surge. And the battalion commander there is saying, hey, we've hit a brick wall in this place. This is a stalemate. And we need to get out of here. And that was just a very, very different message from what I was hearing everywhere else in Afghanistan. You know, one of the analogies that he used and his brigade commander used to sort of try and make the case for the pullout to their higher headquarters was, you know, there's this language surrounding counterinsurgency that dates back to the French in Madagascar in the 1880s or 1890s, the ink blot or oil spot strategy of counterinsurgency. And the way that Joe Ryan and Drew Pappas, his brigade commander, kind of made the case without seeming too subversive, without sort of saying, oh, coin doesn't work or coin has failed, was, hey, you know, ink blot, you know, there are surfaces that ink soaks into, and the Pech may once have been, you know, paper that the counterinsurgency ink was soaking into. But now, today, in 2010, after all these years here and all the civilians that we've mistakenly killed, and all the Taliban that we have deliberately killed, but who killing them has turned their brothers and cousins into Taliban, this is no longer paper that counterinsurgency ink soaks into. This is plastic, and it's not, you know, the ink blots are not expanding. Which I just, to me, it was very, very interesting to hear kind of that level of candor, and to hear that thinking from a battalion commander as he was working through it, you know, as he was working through his recommendations to higher headquarters. And that's the kind of stuff that you just, in the sort of post-embedding world, trying to cover the military, you just never get contemporaneously. You have to reconstruct it after the fact, and it's very difficult. And, you know, you're sort of getting canned lines from spokesmen and generals and stuff.
What did the special operations mission look like in the Pech Valley at this point? Something I know you're quite fond of is, you know, order of battles, how things are structured. What did the structure kind of look like for SOF in eastern Afghanistan, and more specifically around Kunar and the Pech? So really, what were they doing at that point, both Whiteside and JSOC?
Yeah. So it ebbed and flowed, and this was kind of the high point for JSOC in the Pech in terms of ground operations. You know, because the Special Operations Forces had a history up there. They had first, they had been up in Kunar and the Pech long before conventional forces were there. The first JSOC Advanced Force Operations Team got to Asadabad, the provincial capital of Kunar, in about April 2002, and set up a base there that conventional forces wound up inheriting. And so, JSOC and the CIA and the vanilla SOF, who sort of followed in their wake, they had gone up there originally for sort of a very real counterterrorism purpose. They were trying to figure out where bin Laden had gone after Tora Bora. And they wound up getting closer to him than they knew at the time during a raid in the Shigal Valley in the fall of 2002. They basically hit the right place, but a month or two too late. And then the focus shifted to Iraq, and kind of nobody ever knew until much later from insurgent sources that was in fact where bin Laden had been staying for the first few months after Tora Bora. But what happened was there was kind of this mission creep where the Special Operations Forces showed up, they burned themselves out and lost interest because they lost their leads. And so, the JSOC guys kind of in 2003, 2004, they handed things over to Green Berets. And the Green Berets sort of tried to do this inkblot counterinsurgency in the Pech in 2004, 2005, with some pretty decent results at the beginning because people were not embittered against the U.S. presence yet. People were still very optimistic for the most part. Then the Green Beret headquarters sort of changes focus and pulls out, and it's left in the hands of these Marines who've been doing, they had been there doing force protection for the Green Berets, and now they're in charge of the counterinsurgency mission. And then over time, you just sort of gradually see the daytime counterinsurgency war that began with these Green Berets kind of getting handed down from, to larger and larger conventional infantry units. And in parallel, in the background, SOF are still doing their thing. For the JSOC side, for a long time, JSOC had not really been interested in Kunar. It had been interested in it because there was it was a place that and one of the very, very few genuine Arab al-Qaeda figures on the Afghan side of the border ever popped up, a guy named Abu Ikhlas al-Masri. And he was sort of a bright flashing object for JSOC, even though in retrospect, he was probably not nearly as important to al-Qaeda as they thought he was at the time. And the fact that he was on the Afghan side of the border at all was evidence of that. But there was this, Bill Ostland, who's a colonel who commanded the JSOC task force later in the war, but who was a conventional battalion commander in the Pech at one point. I mean, he remembers kind of coming out of conventional battalion command, going to JSOC and telling Admiral McRaven, the task force thinks that the boogeyman lives in Kunar, and it's embarrassing. His perspective was the task force had been, had become gun shy about Kunar because of Operation Red Wings. And, understandably so. I mean, the thing about Kunar is that besides the enemy picture up there, it's incredibly difficult terrain. There's a lot of difficult terrain in Afghanistan, a lot of tough mountains. But what Kunar and Nuristan have that other parts of the country don't is really thick conifer forest, these big dense forests of fir and pine and cedar. And that makes everything so much more difficult. There are very few helicopter landing zones. Even in the ones that there are, the odds that there's going to be a tree stump or something there that's not visible on overhead imagery that you're going to hit are high. And Admiral McRaven at one point said when one of the conventional brigades was sort of pushing for more task force involvement up in Kunar, his sort of dismissive response was, "I've parked enough helicopters up there." But nevertheless, in 2009, when the JSOC task force switched from SEAL Team 6 leadership to Ranger Regiment leadership, and kind of the broader JSOC strategy in the country became one of support to conventional forces. We're going after the targets that the conventional forces want gone after because they're the main effort and we're the supporting effort, which was that was the whole sort of Ranger philosophy to the task force. They pushed the SEAL Squadron and its attached Ranger platoon that were up at Jalalabad to do a lot more Kunar missions. And so in 2009 and 2010, for a period of about 2 years, the task force was going up into Kunar pretty regularly, but it did so at a cost. There was just in 2010, in the spring of 2010, there was a Gold Squadron operator who was killed on a mission way out in the Chapadara area of the Pech, going after an IED maker who had killed American troops in the Pech. Later that year, The next SEAL Team 6 squadron had sort of the botched Linda Norgrove mission up there that left a sour taste in their mouths. And then in November of 2010, a really beloved Ranger squad leader from 1st Ranger Battalion was killed during a mission deep into the Wadapur Valley in this place called the Gambir Jungle in support of conventional forces. And so what winds up happening is the following year, 2011, JSOC really turns off its ground operations in Kunar pretty much forever and shifts to a kinetic strike campaign, kind of just making the judgment that it's not worth risking helicopters and risking strike forces up there when we have this drone fleet that has been growing, and all these TTPs that the CIA has perfected across the border in Pakistan. So kind of the high point for JSOC in terms of their number of raids up in this rugged area was 2009, 2010, before they shifted into the Operation Haymaker drone strike campaign.
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Gold Squadron operator that was killed in the spring of 2010, was that Adam Brown?
That's right. That was Chief Brown. Yeah.
And the Ranger squad leader would have been Staff Sergeant Pape?
That was it's Poppy.
Poppy,
Staff Sergeant Kent Poppy. Yeah.
All right. So if it's okay, I'd like you to speak a little bit more about the enemy in Kunar. You mentioned the Al-Qaeda and Arab element that wasn't really present in other parts of Afghanistan. How did that kind of implicate JSOC into being there? I know you mentioned bin Laden, but were there really this influx of foreign fighters in Kunar? Was it really like that, or how did that kind of work?
It's a complicated story. I mean, the superficial level of it is, yes, there was always Al-Qaeda in Kunar in a way that there was not in most other parts of the country for many, many, many years. But it wasn't, the more complicated version is when the U.S. invaded, there was no Al-Qaeda in Kunar at all. There were no, it was not a place that Al-Qaeda had ever had training camps. And in fact, there was hardly any Taliban in Kunar. The Taliban controlled the provincial capital, but they hadn't really exerted much more control than that. Really, they had just they had co-opted some of the local bigwigs and, exerted their control to an extent, that way. And what winds up happening is U.S. forces, they're on the trail of bin Laden. They correctly guessed that bin Laden has gone up to Kunar because of bin Laden understands the advantages of trees and mountains and in evading aerial surveillance. So U.S. Special Operations Forces follow him up there, but he leaves, and then they get really fixated on Abu Ikhlas, this Egyptian figure who was Al-Qaeda, but who was, if you think about sort of the two missions that Al-Qaeda has always been simultaneously pursuing, sort of the mission of global jihad and the mission of local jihad. Abu Ikhlas really was sort of an Al-Qaeda Green Beret. He was there advising local insurgents. He was not an international attack plotter. And this was sort of because Al-Qaeda was a closed network that was trying to have the United States not understand anything about it. U.S. forces did not understand this. And so they kept going after Abu Ikhlas. In this kind of, through 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, anytime he popped up, that was, the Omega team at Asadabad would mobilize, or it also played into kind of the big conventional ground offensives that led to all the outposts being built in 2006. But the irony is this U.S. interest in Abu Ikhlas helps bring the Taliban to Kunar. Because, one of the places that Abu Ikhlas keeps popping up, or, is thought to be popping up, is the Korengal Valley. And U.S. forces get kind of sucked into the Korengal Valley, in a way that they don't understand at the time. Because essentially what's happening is the Korengalis, who are a separate ethno-linguistic group who live in the side valley of the Pech, and they control a very large reserve of really nice cedar timber. Their business counterparts, the lowland Safi Pashtuns in the Pech Valley, who are their route to selling their timber off to Pakistan. Basically, the Korengalis' business partners were also the U.S.'s early militias in Kunar. And they used the U.S. as sort of unwitting muscle to try to renegotiate the terms of their timber deals with the Korengalis. And the Korengalis, in turn, brought in the Taliban as their muscle. And so there's this commercial dispute over timber that winds up, turning the Korengal into this arena of combat between two types of outside forces, Taliban, who hadn't been in Kunar before, and U.S. forces who hadn't been in Kunar before. And as this escalates and continues in 2006, 2007, 2008, al-Qaeda recruits, new Arabs who've recently arrived in the Fatah also start coming to Kunar because, what it's used for by the Taliban and by the al-Qaeda guys who embed with the Taliban is it's almost like a capstone exercise or a place that you get sent to be initiated or to earn your combat infantry badge. And so starting in, about 2009, more al-Qaeda guys start to show up, but it's very under the radar. The U.S. forces, the U.S. conventional forces in the Valley don't really understand it. And in fact, it's not really until 2011, after U.S. conventional forces have pulled out of the Pech, that the Abbottabad DocX, the files that were captured at bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, they reveal the importance of a particular young al-Qaeda figure who has been staying in the Korengal Valley north of the Pech, named Farouk al-Qahtani. And so he sort of goes from being thought of as just one more young al-Qaeda advisor to, who's trying to get his war on, to, okay, this is actually a guy who bin Laden knew about personally and was giving personal instructions to. And so that's the genesis of Operation Haymaker, the concerted JSOC drone campaign up in the Pech, starting in 2011.
So more about the enemy up in Kunar. We had Dylan, who was a Army Ranger with 3rd Ranger Battalion. He had deployed to Ramadi in 2006, 2007. And during the podcast, he talked about, the myth of Juba the Sniper, and how it was a persistent threat to the infantry battalions. But, they never really could figure it out. Was it multiple people? Was it one dude? And although it wasn't really as much of a threat for the Ranger Battalion there, was there a similar sort of boogeyman up in Kunar, up in the Pech?
I remember the stories of Juba the Sniper in Baghdad in 2007. There were boogeymen, and I think often the U.S. made those boogeymen. Not that it turned them into insurgents, but it focused on particular guys too much in a way that allowed them to gave them credibility to rise in the insurgent hierarchy. The big examples of this for Kunar. The U.S. was always chasing Abu Ikhlas, who was not who we made him out to be. He was not sort of an international terrorist attack plotter. So he's number one. A second one is Ahmed Shah. Was sort of the pseudonym, is also known as Commander Ismail, this low-level insurgent figure who brought down the Turban 3-3 Chinook during Operation Red Wings. Because he had so much U.S. blood on his hands from this lucky shot where his RPG gunner brought down a helicopter full of SEALs and Night Stalkers, he became almost like a revenge target. And U.S. forces became very focused on anywhere that he was, they were going to try and go and get him. And kind of the inadvertent result of this is that it raised his profile. He became more important within the insurgency. He got more funding and more arms from Big T Taliban back in Peshawar. And eventually he sort of fades out of the war in Kunar and goes back to Pakistan, and he's killed in 2008 on the Pakistani side of the border. But that's a story that repeats itself. Another is a guy named Dowran, Mullah Dowran, who eventually was killed in a drone strike in 2013. This is a guy who had he was a Salafist. He had no affiliation with the Taliban before 9/11. In fact, he had fought against the Taliban, as a lot of Salafists in Kunar had. But within the first couple years, as the U.S. starts to detain the wrong people, kill civilians by mistake, Abu Ikhlas is sort of starting to activate an insurgent network. Dowron, who is this sort of wealthy figure from the town of Sundre in the Pech, he goes up into the hills and he becomes one of the founding members of the Pech insurgency. And it's actually not for many years that he formally affiliates himself with the Taliban. He doesn't formally affiliate himself with the Taliban until after a 2009 HIMARS rocket strike that the U.S. Launches on him, which he survives, but which kills his wife and several of his children. And it's only after that he formally becomes affiliated with the Taliban. Up until that point, he had been fighting on behalf of a small Salafi group, which was, the insurgency in Kunar for a long time was a network of small Salafi groups that gradually the Taliban exerted control over, and then they gradually fell out of Taliban control when ISIS showed up. And many of them kind of switched over to ISIS in the 2015, 16, 17 period. Cool. Yep.
So real quick, was VSO prominent at all in the Pech Valley village stability operations? Were SOF in Kunar and Pech Valley doing that at all? Was it, were the successes and failures really notable?
No, VSO never happened in the Pech. There's sort of a section that I had to cut from the book for length, but essentially the timing just, so Jim Gant comes into Eastern Kunar, and, Jim Gant appears in the book earlier from when he was an ODA commander. Young, excited ODA commander just trying to get into fights, is the way he described it to me back in 2003. But he comes back to Kunar in 2010, but he goes to Eastern Kunar. And so, at the same time that Jim Gant is setting up kind of these initial VSO sites in Eastern Kunar, that's the same time that these U.S. infantry battalions in the Pech and the Korengal are just banging their heads against the wall. In these endless firefights. I mean, just these outposts that are getting attacked, 3, 4, 5 times a day, all this stuff. And so there was sort of a last ditch effort, and this is the section that I, just didn't have room for in the book. But in the fall of 2010, as Colonel Ryan, the battalion commander in the Pech, was making the case to his higher headquarters to pull out of the Pech, he did go to kind of local leaders in the Pech and say, hey, we can pull out if you want it. There is this thing, VSO. And if you are willing to kind of, stand up against the Taliban on your own, we can bring some Green Berets in here. And they can, kind of continue what we've been doing, but in this VSO format. And there just wasn't any interest, is the way Colonel Ryan describes it. I mean, basically, the communities in the Pech were so jaded and so over it and so done with sticking their neck out for any Americans at that point that it didn't go anywhere. Jim Gant still had hopes, when he got removed from Kunar in early 2011 or whenever that was. He still had sort of hopes in his head of pushing VSO up the Chowkay Valley and down the Shuriak and getting into the Pech that way, but it never came to fruition.
So, meanwhile, this is all going on. Can you talk a bit about the CIA and more specifically the paramilitary involvement in the Pech? People are becoming more and more aware of the Omega program and SOF as that kind of stuff comes to light in the twilight of the GWOT. How did that work in Kunar and the Pech?
Yeah, so there always was a CIA base at Asadabad. For a long time, there was also a CIA base farther north in Kunar called Falcon Base at Barikat. And then for a while, there was a smaller CIA base right on the border at Gaki Pass. And what the CIA was doing in Kunar changed over the years, and there were always two dimensions to it. Just as on the military side, kind of the special operations guys were doing one thing and the conventional forces were doing another thing. On every one of these CIA bases, there was kind of a split between the paramilitaries who are doing their thing with their surrogate forces, the CTPTs, and then the case officers who are focused across the border at developing targets for the drone campaign in Pakistan. And so, the CTPT surrogate force in Kunar, which eventually became known as NDS-04, but it went by other names earlier in the war. It was called the Mohawks. It was called the Tigers. but it was this unit that for conventional forces fighting in Kunar, its existence was frustrating because it was this highly trained, well-equipped unit of Afghan CIA commandos living at Asadabad that really didn't seem to have authority to do much more than kind of secure the immediate area around their base from rocket attacks. And it was like the example the analogy that guys always give me is it was like this Ferrari that couldn't be taken out of the garage. And this is, I'm digging sort of deeper into this now for this new book project, but I think this is sort of emblematic of something that was happening with the CTPTs in Afghanistan, where, essentially the agency had created them with one purpose in mind, sort of cross-border operations. And it was a purpose that never really panned out. It was just it was not feasible in the way that sort of that the originators of the CTPTs intended it to be. And so for a long time, the CTPTs became kind of a capability in search of a mission. And for the CIA, I mean, they were getting, it cost very little to maintain these units. It got great sort of work in for the paramilitary guys. It helped cement the relationship with JSOC via the Omega teams. But what these units were actually there to do was often kind of a big unanswered question, especially during kind of the middle years of the war. They kind of get let off the leash in the later years of the war as U.S. forces draw down. Then the CTPTs start to play a really, really prominent role. Not just as surrogate forces for the CIA, which they remained, but also just as kind of crack fighting units for the Afghan government, which is the role that they wind up playing kind of in the final years. But there is a kind of a one last flurry of U.S. activity on the ground in Kunar in 2017, 18, 19. When at that point there was an Omega team or an ANSOF team called ANSOF 20 that was based at Jalalabad and that worked with both the Kunar-based CTPT and the Jalalabad-based CTPT, and they got permission from JSOC and the CIA to do a series of what they call deep valley penetrations, so kind of big missions up into not so much the Pech, but valleys off the Kunar Valley. Where they would go up and hit a target, often in pursuit of. This was an era when basically JSOC was really focused on ISIS-K at this time, and the CIA was really focused on sort of the remnants of core al-Qaeda, and they were looking for Hamza bin Laden's sort of son and heir in particular. And so there were a series of missions in Kunar in 2018, 2019. Where the ANSOF team that's attached to the CTPT, NDSO2, NDSO4, they're going after targets that they think are associated with Hamza bin Laden, where Hamza bin Laden has recently been, things like that.
So those raids in 2016 and 17, those deep valley penetrations, did that happen around the same time as the Operation Greensword template that the JSOC task force was doing, where they had that big push into Nangarhar and the heat casualties? Yeah,
kind of contemporaneous with that. I mean, so essentially, I wrote a story about this at the time about sort of, this division of labor and sort of what happened to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I mean, I think for the Ranger-led JSOC task force, when they got let off the leash to go after ISIS-K in 2016, that was really exciting for them because they had been stuck doing this kind of very frustrating long-term target development on, a handful of al-Qaeda figures who had very, very good operational security, especially including objective smokescreen, Farouk al-Qahtani, who he just was impossible to get until they finally got him. But so for 2016, the Obama administration tells the JSOC task force, okay, ISIS-K is a target you guys can go after. The JSOC task force really just shifts all of its effort onto ISIS-K, because as one Ranger colonel put it to me, I mean, you could just, in 2016, 2017, you could just put ISR up over Nangarhar and see concentrations of enemy troops and start dropping bombs on them. And that was just a much more satisfying way of doing business, for Rangers than this kind of long-term target development. Maybe the battalion after you gets to take a strike kind of thing. And so that's how it's during that period, especially, during the Trump administration, when Mike Pompeo is the CIA director, and he wants the agency to resume the more aggressive role that the Obama administration had sort of been trying to fade it out of in its final year. That's when you start seeing the CIA and its CTPTs being more active in Afghanistan, not just going against al-Qaeda, but also as part of the broader war against the Taliban, the maximum pressure campaign against the Taliban.
So how does this end up leading into what I believe was dubbed the Taliban Air Force, or the JSOC Task Force?
Yeah. This is a strange, this is essentially the way the war ends for the United States in Kunar, is as hard as it is to believe or conceive of, kind of the final months of U.S. involvement in Kunar in 2019 and 2020, approaching the Doha Agreement. What JSOC is doing is it's listening in on the Taliban via SIGINT, just like it's always done, but instead of striking the Taliban, it's using that information to help the Taliban against ISIS-K. So even though everywhere else in the country, the U.S. is hammering the Taliban with this massive air campaign, up in Kunar, the Taliban is seen as the lesser of two evils. And so the JSOC task force, in particular, the little cell that they called Team East at the time, that was responsible for kind of the, targeting and lining up drone strikes in Kunar, what they were doing, particularly in the Chowkay Valley, a little bit the Korengal, the Shuriak, the Wadapur as well, is they were helping the Taliban. They weren't talking to them, but they were identifying, okay, this Taliban, platoon commander is worried about this ISIS-K machine gun nest on this hill, before he attacks them tomorrow. So we're going to do a drone strike on that machine gun nest to sort of facilitate this Taliban commander's advance as he tries to take back the Korengal from ISIS. And this was a very bizarre thing, I think, for a lot of, long-serving Rangers in the task force to see. Among the guys that I interviewed about it, I didn't hear anyone who sort of thought that it was wrong. One of the quotes was essentially, everybody would like to be out there, getting after that themselves. But in Kunar at this point in the war, it was pretty obvious that what we've been doing for a long time wasn't working. But, so the joke was that Team East was the Taliban Air Force. And after I published the book, I included that detail in the book based on what someone had told me. But then after I published the book, someone actually sent me a photo of a little sign that they kept that said Taliban Air Force.
It's kind of interesting that you mentioned the difference in how different units were targeting the Taliban at that point in time and around the country. One of the previous episodes, we had on a Marine Raider who was there around the time frame that you mentioned, 2019. Their entire directive was, hey, you have to get to the Taliban, to the table by any means necessary. And they were going out doing, helicopter assault force raids all over Southern Afghanistan.
Right. No, this is, those raiders, I think that's kind of an untold story in Raider history. But yeah, they were very, very aggressive. And this was by the time in the war when embedding had ended, and there's a lot still to be told about that period of the war when it was very soft heavy. It was much harder to kind of understand the tactical and operational details on a day-to-day basis. But I think that Team Raider, which was actually working for JSOC at that time, which was an exciting thing, I think, for that, for the MARSOC guys. They were part of General Miller. Kind of gave all the JSOC task force, including this Team Raider element that was attached to them, the job of, hey, just slam them, just as many Taliban bodies as you can stack them. Whether that really contributed to the Doha deal, and if so, in what way, I think it's going to be a question for historians. I know there's sort of a soldier wisdom at this point that it's like, oh, well, by hitting them so hard, like General Miller wanted us to, we helped bring them to the table. I don't know that that's sort of been rigorously analyzed yet. And I think it's going to be really interesting in years to come especially to hear the Taliban's perspective on why they agreed to what they did when they did.
Yeah, no, I mean you're right. They fell directly under the umbrella of Team BAF, the strike force at Bagram, as you know, obviously. Are you aware of any other units that had a similar arrangement around that time? You know, maybe not necessarily in Kunar, but in Afghanistan, where were the ODAs doing it as well?
Everybody was doing. I mean, in 2018, 2019, I mean, General Miller's thing was just you're off the leash. Go after, just drop as many bombs on as many Taliban as you can. I mean, so there were, and this was a period when, I mean, there were some JSOC elements that kind of came back into the country that had been out of the country for a while because of the ISIS fight and because of Somalia and Yemen. There was a SEAL Team 6 element. SEAL Team 6 had been out of Afghanistan for several years, basically since 2014. But they come back in. They set up a vehicle interdiction troop in Helmand that's supposed to go after Taliban leaders. I get the impression that it didn't really pan out or catch too many people of much significance. But yeah, everybody was I think everybody was sort of trying to get in on it. I had one for a magazine story that I'm doing kind of about organizational culture in different SOF units. I had one former SEAL Team 6 squadron commander say to me, he was like, yeah, when we left Afghanistan, everybody was really excited to be going to Somalia and Yemen. They were like, fuck Afghanistan, stupid place, tired of that. And then in 2018, he's got these same guys saying, hey, how do I get on that Afghanistan deployment? How do I get back to Afghanistan?
So that program that you mentioned, really interesting that you mentioned it about the DEVGRU vehicle interdiction troop. There's a podcast out there about a bunch of Rangers from, I believe, ACO 175 that were actually on that trip to Dwyer, I believe, where the strike force was out of, and they mentioned just being stuck in the MH-47s all day in the sweltering heat. Their assessment kind of leads me to believe as well. Yeah, they probably didn't get to do much, but
I'd like to listen to that. If you wouldn't mind sending me the link to that later, that would be
definitely
great.
We'll get that set up afterwards. It's definitely very crass and explicit, as Rangers usually are, but it's a very interesting take into what was going on at that point in the war. So going on post-Afghanistan, what does it look like for that first withdrawal that you kind of hinted at, and then the second one, the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Where does the United States start focusing its special operations efforts after, sort of in that 2021 until now period? What is, it's a very broad question, but what does Yemen look like? What does Somalia look like? What is the presence in these countries right now as far as U.S. counterterrorism goes?
It's very hard to kind of contemporaneously, keep track of in real time what these presences look like. I mean, the best I can do is keep track of, what did things look like a couple years ago or 3 years ago. I'm still piecing together, what did the later years in Afghanistan look like? What was going on in Somalia in 2017, 2018, 2019. So, as far as what's going on today, I mean, that's just something where I have a much vaguer and fuzzier picture. Probably Syria and Iraq are the place where we have the best information, because CENTCOM actually releases monthly summaries of, how many partnered raids and how many unilateral raids it's done. And, there are periodic Delta Force raids in Syria that will kill some ISIS figure. So, we know about that. As far as Yemen and Somalia, I mean, it's much harder, other than the occasional publicized event like the SEAL Team 6 raid in January or February that killed that sort of that ISIS Somalia figure. We know that there's several hundred U.S. Special Operations Forces are back in Somalia on a permanent basis, but what they're doing now compares to what they were doing in 2018, 2019, kind of at the peak in Somalia pre-pullout, just don't have much information. And, in terms of kind of how far forward are they allowed to go? When these collective self-defense strikes get called in, which AFRICOM announces, I mean, are those, are Green Beret teams actually out there with the Danab, in the fight, versus are they back at a compound and they're calling them in? That's just stuff that we don't know right now.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think there's inherently sort of a tricky nature to these kind of things when you're interested in something that's pretty niche, pretty obscure. There's not going to be a lot about it, and just with the secrecy of how SOCOM operates, how JSOC operates, it's. I
mean, and also how the Biden administration frames our involvement in the Middle East. I mean, the president has said that the war on terrorism is over. So, it's sort of the remnants of it that are definitely still going on are not things that, I think that the administration is keen to share a huge amount of detail about.
Yeah, I have a couple friends in the Army, and they're not happy that they're not going to be getting the Global War on Terror service ribbon or the National Defense service ribbon.
Yeah, everybody's always worried that they joined a little too late, but it's staying long enough. There's always something.
So going back to 127 Echo, so really in your research and what you detailed so far, like what have you found out about the program? What's something that's been pretty surprising to you? And something I was always curious about is how does the U.S. select these local surrogate forces that they work with? How do they find them? Who stands them up? And then, as I understand, sometimes they get passed off from, maybe the CIA to JSOC or from the JSOC to White SOF. How has that sort of worked over the
very much.
GWOT?
I mean, so I first came to kind of 127 Echo in the aftermath of, I was covering the Pentagon at the time of the Tongo Tongo ambush in the fall of 2017, where 2 Green Berets and 2 Special Forces support soldiers were killed. And sort of suddenly there was this flurry of attention and, what's the U.S. military doing in West Africa? What's all this about? And, one thing that was very striking to me in covering the aftermath of Tongo Tongo was that in the military's statements about what happened at Tongo Tongo and in its investigation that it released the following year, there were 2 ODAs involved. There was the ODA that actually was in the firefight and took the casualties, which was called Team Wallam after the place where it was based. And then there was another one called Team Arlit. And everything about Team Arlit was redacted in these in the documents that the military, that the AFRICOM investigation public release version. But it was clear that something that Team Arlit had been doing had precipitated Team Wallam's being in the place where it was when it was ambushed. So I just was like, I just want to pull on that thread. I mean, what was Team Arlit? Why does the military, not want to talk about it? And what it turns out that it was that while Team Wallam was working with sort of a regular partner force, just kind of a standard conventional part of the Nigerian military, those were the partners that they were with when they got attacked. The other ODA up in Arlit, they had a 127 Echo partner force, which was actually a very small partner force of 30 or 40 guys that the U.S. referred to as the EFON, the Expeditionary Force of Niger. And that was my entry point. And so I was like, okay, so what is this? And what I came to learn about the EFON was that it is an example of exactly what you alluded to, kind of a program being handed off and passed down in a way that, to me, is a little bit kind of conceptually reminiscent of what you'd see with the outposts in Eastern Afghanistan, where the CIA or JSOC builds an outpost for one purpose. They hand it off to Green Berets. The Green Berets hand it off to Marines. The Marines hand it off to a conventional Army unit. And kind of over time, through all these transitions, the original purpose is lost or outlived, but the new units will keep finding reasons to, will keep finding missions because that's what they do. And I think the EFON in Niger is a little bit like that. It was, as I understand it, it was stood up by Delta Force around 2012, sort of during this interregnum period where Delta Force was out of Iraq post 2011, went back into Iraq in 2014. But in 2012 and 2013, it had this North Africa mission, which, the most publicized examples of are, snatch and grabs that it did in Libya after the Benghazi attacks. But part of what it was doing was it was setting up 127 Echo forces. It actually was, when the Benghazi attack happened, the 2 Delta Force soldiers, or the Delta Force soldier and the Delta Force Marine, who were in Tripoli at that time, what they were in Tripoli doing was laying the groundwork for a Libyan 127 Echo force that never really panned out because of what happened after Benghazi. But at the same time, Delta Force was also standing up the EFON in Niger. But what winds up happening is, essentially, Delta, it has a 10th Group team attached to it to sort of help with the training. And then they would use the EFON as sort of true surrogates, forces that would go out without any type of U.S. footprint or face on them. The Delta guys would do some, pretty exciting things like do military freefall jumps out into the desert to set up forward arming and refueling points for the EFON to stop at. And they would use, JSOC helicopters to fly the EFON around as they kind of did this. The idea of the EFON was that it was doing interdictions on kind of these rat lines coming out of Libya down into the Sahel. But what winds up happening is 2014 rolls around, Mosul falls, Delta Force pulls up stakes and goes all in back to Iraq. And so the EFON gets handed down to 10th Group. It goes from a JSOC 127 Echo program to a SOCAF, Special Operations Command Africa Theater SOF 127 Echo program. And as part of that, all the JSOC resources go away. The helicopters, the ISR, the things that Delta Force had with it, besides the very small number of operators that it had been devoting to this 127 Echo program. So for the 10th Group team, they kind of see it as, well, the best we can do with this 127 Echo is sort of transition it back to a regular kind of partner program. But after a year of 10th Group control, there's a reshuffling in, kind of Green Beret areas of responsibility, and 3rd Group comes in. And 3rd Group takes over the EFON. And 3rd Group comes to West Africa, fresh out of years and years and years in Afghanistan. And it has a very distinct and very cemented approach to how it works with its partners. And, essentially they saw it as, hey, we're used to running ANA commandos on direct action missions, and that's what we're going to do with this EFON. And so it kind of, what winds up happening is the EFON, the purpose of the EFON gets flipped on its head, where originally the idea was it could go out into the desert without any Americans having to go with it. And that was the point. To under 3rd Group, because the EFON is the only force that kind of that you can call the shots about, and also because it has some limited contract air, helicopter capability. It becomes the team you want to get on to get as close as you can to contact, to get out near the objective. Which is not the point of the surrogate force, right? In the first place, it's the opposite of the point of the surrogate force. But that's kind of the transition that happens. I mean, I think just basically due to, a program being handed down from unit to unit to unit, but without kind of really a clear through line of what the mission is, and without sort of an auditing process to turn it off when the mission is either no longer relevant or no longer resourced.
And if I'm not wrong, did a similar phenomenon occur in, Syria and Yemen, where the JSOC task force would shed a lot of its responsibilities, sometimes its partner units? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there are. I don't want to get into too many specific examples because I'm kind of saving them for the book. But this is a phenomenon of JSOC realizes that a 127 Echo force that it has stood up is not really living up to what they expected it to live up to. So rather than discontinue it, they shunt it off onto Theater SOF, who are then left to figure out what to do with it.
So what sort of flavor of partner force units do you see being employed as the surrogates? Are they all kind of the same? Do they blend together? Is there a distinct difference? The way I understand it, it can be pretty diverse. I mean, Afghanistan, they had the NMRG, the National Mine Reduction Group. You had ARU, Afghan Reconnaissance Unit, and then compared and contrasted that to the units in Africa. How did they sort of differ from country to country?
Yeah, absolutely. They differed hugely from country to country. I mean, I think in Africa, there was sort of a pattern of, sort of a platoon or company level direct action force that you would carve out of an existing host nation military force. Maybe the host nation has an airborne brigade or something. In Cameroon, it was the BIR, sort of this division level light infantry unit, and they carved a small 127 Echo force out of that. But outside the context of AFRICOM, there's much more diversity to kind of what 127 Echo and its predecessor 1208 were used for. And Afghanistan, of course, is the place where it was originally used. I mean, it was, 1208 was developed be used in Afghanistan, to give Green Berets the ability to pay and fund and equip irregular forces without having to ask the CIA for money. And so, yeah, I mean, the NMRG is a great example of a 127 Echo program that looks completely different from kind of the direct action surrogate forces in AFRICOM, like the EFON. The NMRG is a force that was, I feel like it's what 1208 was originally envisioned for, almost, is allowing Green Berets to directly hire and train local soldiers, local forces, to perform kind of expert tasks for them. And the NMRG is one that I'm gonna get deep into in this book, but it's it had a clandestine purpose and an overt purpose. But the overt purpose was, I mean, they were minesweepers for U.S. Green Beret teams. And they did that for years and years and years, and they took very heavy losses. And there's, it's no coincidence that the organization that's sort of trying really hard to get a lot of those guys out of the country is called the 1208 Foundation, because they were in many ways kind of like a flagship 1208 and 127 Echo that was seen as being very, very successful at what it was meant to do.
I mean, definitely. I'll be looking forward to the chapter in the book about that. A lot of what we try to do here is really document the actions of these partner units as well. I feel like they're often overlooked and not mentioned as, even though these US SOF units are going out partnered bilaterally with them, they're working by, with, and through, often using them to perform tactical callouts and clearing rooms first. So it's always interesting to hear that perspective about the partner force units in these deployments.
Absolutely, and I mean that's sort of what I'm hoping to do with this book as well. Is the surrogate forces in particular. I mean, in many ways they were fighting for the United States in our war on terrorism, just like American soldiers were. And I think there is an opportunity now to tell some of those stories. Especially a lot of CTPT members now are in the United States because they, unlike the 127 Echo guys, got evacuated during the pullout. A lot of the, many more of the military's partners are still stuck in Afghanistan, and their stories are going to be a lot harder or going to be lost. But I completely agree that there is an incredibly rich sort of military history to be told about what these forces did during the wars. And I mean, and part of that is, you can talk to U.S. advisors all day long about these units, but you need to talk to the members of the units too, because they're always going to have it. It's always going to look a little different from their perspective. I mean, one of the it can. I think I was talking the other day to a former CIA officer who was in charge of the Afghanistan Covert Action Program in the 1980s for a period of time. And he's very skeptical of kind of the notion of surrogate forces in the post 9/11 era. His view is that there is sort of an illusion of control that we have, when in fact it's a two-way street, and our surrogates are controlling us as well in ways that we often don't understand. Which I think my experience in Afghanistan and sort of what I learned about Kunar and the Pech and the way that U.S. forces were used for various purposes by their partners and proxies. I think that's always true. There are always dimensions to whatever partner or surrogate force you're working with, and you think that you're using them to achieve your ends. They're using you to achieve their ends too. I mean, I thought one of the biggest laughs I've had recently is there was I guess this must have actually been from like 2020, but it popped back up in my like memories on Instagram or Facebook or something. But it was this meme, such a niche meme of it's like it's a Tiger King and ANSF partnering meme, where there's like an ANA commando who's got the face of the Tiger King guy superimposed on him, and he's saying, who's harboring the Taliban? Carol fucking Baskin, that's who. Which I think perfectly summed up your proxy, your proxies are using you too. And that's, I mean, even going back to the very beginning of the war in Kunar, Kunari, who was very close to the Americans in 2002 and 2003, close to the Green Berets, his insight, to me was, the Americans came in, they allied with this sort of rapacious warlord, Malik Zareen. The only thing that anybody in Kunar had appreciated about the Taliban was that he sort of kept Malik Zareen off their backs. And now the U.S. is working with Malik Zareen. And the question that Kunaris start asking is, who is whose proxy? Is Malik Zareen the Americans' proxy, or are the Americans Malik Zareen's proxy?
So specifically when it comes to 127 Echo, how do you gain information without embedding? You say, the age of embedding is over. It's not really something you can do anymore. How do you research? How do you reach out to people involved in this, especially with the level of secrecy that a lot of these programs are under?
You talk to people after the fact. I am still reaping the benefits of the time that I spent, embedding as a young guy, because, guys that were platoon leaders that whose platoon I followed around in the pasture in Paktika or somewhere are now, Green Beret majors. People continue to serve and have careers in the military. And, I think there's a level of trust that you could build up during, in those relationships in the embedded context, it would be very, very hard for kind of a journalist starting out now, to kind of, establish some of those same kinds of relationships. But yeah, I just rely on word of mouth. I rely on people refer me to other people. My book, The Hardest Place, seems like it's been sort of a hit in some parts of the special operations community. And so I've had a lot of people just kind of cold reach out over the past 2 years, as they've learned kind of what my next project is, saying, hey, I like The Hardest Place. I'd be interested in helping tell the story for your next one. So yeah, kind of, just the more work you do on it, the more people come out of the woodwork to help you understand. Inevitably you get things wrong. People come out of the woodwork to help you correct them. When I first reported on 127 Echo, in the context of Tongo Tongo and Niger, I was looking at 127 Echo through a soda straw, and I was only appreciating and understanding the part of it that was these direct action forces in Africa, and I had no idea about the NMRG. So it's as I've learned more since then, kind of my understanding has become fuller.
No, I definitely get that. Even with the podcasts and the Instagram page that we run, we get people hitting us up that maybe are in the pictures or know people that are in the pictures and talk about, oh yeah, I was in Somalia in 2008 with RRC, and you're like,
yeah.
You go on his profile, he's followed by other soft guys, and you get the sense that he's legit. And we get these DMs, you get people talking about it all the time in this picture, so I definitely get that aspect of it. How do you see the future for 127 Echo going forward, and specifically as JSOC and the military in general transitions to the near peer fight, the LISCO large scale combat operation? How do you think the future is for 127 Echo?
I think 127 Echo will kind of fall by the wayside, and I think that 1202, the sort of the broader authority that was introduced in 2017 for the great power competition context, I think that's sort of the future of surrogate forces for SOF is Section 1202. I think that there are some. The military tried to get some legislative changes made to Section 1202 last year, because there was, I did a story about this for the Post earlier this year, but essentially, because of the way Section 1202 is worded, it says that it can only be used in situations short of traditional armed conflict. And so both JSOC and SOCUR were running 1202 surrogate programs in Ukraine starting in 2018 or so, that they had to discontinue after Russia launched its full-scale invasion. because DOD's position was, well, this has now transitioned into a traditional armed conflict, which 1202 is not applicable for. And this has been very frustrating for special operations forces, for special forces. And so last year they tried unsuccessfully to have the language in Section 1202 changed, so that, basically the idea is, there's a lot of pressure from 1202 fans in Congress to stand up 1202s in places like Taiwan. And what SOCOM wants is that, if China were to invade Taiwan, they want to not have to discontinue that 1202 program the way they had to discontinue the Ukraine 1202 programs. So this year, coming up to the Pentagon budget bill this fall, there's going to be a lot of discussion about whether 1202 is going to be codified into a permanent authority, whether kind of the definition of irregular warfare in it is going to be changed to be more expansive. But I think that's going to be kind of an important thing to follow, that I'll probably write more about later this year as it becomes clearer what changes are or aren't going to happen. But I would tend to think, I think there's sort of two schools of thought on it from people that I've interviewed. One is that Congress wrote 1202 the way that it did for a reason, and it's because it doesn't want surrogate forces to, get us into World War III through some inadvertent escalation. The other side of the coin might be, US SOF can make a pretty good case that we gave up a good capability that we had for no good reason, because of the way that wording was. So we'll see which one comes out on top and whether there's a change to the law for next year.
That program in Europe, did it have anything to do with the 4th Battalion, sort of the JEDBRG teams that were sort of stood up?
I don't believe so. It's possible that it did, but my understanding, as it was described to me for the article that I wrote in February, is that essentially the two 1202 programs that were active in Ukraine, one was a JSOC program that was kind of reconnaissance focused. Send Ukrainian operatives out into the Donbass to collect electronic signatures off of Russian air defense batteries that are not supposed to be there, that kind of thing. And that the other one was the theater SOF one was very PSYOP oriented, information operations oriented, and that what it was doing was it was funding Ukrainian counter-Russian disinformation efforts. So I don't want to name the specific sites, but there were sort of blogs and sites that were dedicated to calling out Russian disinformation, to calling out the Russians say they don't have any forces in the Donbass, but here's a photograph of a GRU colonel, et cetera, et cetera.
So as we transition to closing out here, how do you see the sort of the twilight of the GWOT ending? How do you see counterterrorism in the future? Do you think it's still going to be maintained as this capability that we have now?
Yeah, great question. I think it's something that, it depends on sort of what the level of threat is, right? And I think that's sort of the big question that everybody has is, how much of a threat still is Al-Qaeda? How much of a threat of international terrorism is ISIS still? It's really striking to me that despite all the rhetoric, all the end the forever war rhetoric that really helped drive both the Trump and Biden administrations to wash their hands of Afghanistan, there really is no similar rhetoric surrounding Syria or Iraq, where there still remain whatever, I think it's like 1,500 U.S. troops in Iraq. Maybe it's more than that. And then, something like 900 U.S. troops in Syria. And these include not just SOF, but conventional forces. There's a U.S. infantry battalion that lives at Al-Tanf garrison in southern Syria. It's sort of the last conventional infantry outpost of the forever wars, and you just never hear about it. I think that in Syria, which I'm by no means an expert on, there isn't really an exit strategy that the U.S. has, right? I mean, we have these, US SOF and the conventional forces that work with them have these, predominantly Kurdish YPG SDF partners, and so long as we're there working with them, they are a force that can kind of keep a lid on ISIS. But there's I don't know that there's an end game at all to it, an idea of how it will end.
Yeah, fair enough. So as we go more towards closing out here, we usually give the guest an opportunity to, there's a charity that they want to plug or a foundation or just anything that they didn't get a chance to talk about before, if they wanted to say it. It's kind of your show, man.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to plug a charity, I would plug the Committee to Protect Journalists, which was incredibly helpful to me in getting one of my former Afghan colleagues out of Afghanistan after the evacuation. They made it happen where the U.S. government didn't make it happen. The Committee to Protect Journalists is an incredible organization to which I owe a great debt for what they did for my friend. So that would be my charity to plug.
Awesome, man. So thank you so much for coming on. I felt like it was a really insightful conversation. I know we definitely didn't cover half of as much as I'm sure you're prepared to talk about, but we can always see what we can do about scheduling you to be back on. I feel like that would be really interesting as you progress more with the book. Looking forward to it coming out.
Yeah, sounds good. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Yep. Awesome, man. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.